How old do you think India's love affair with chai is? 2000 years? 1000 years? 500 years? 200 years? What if I told you that the everyday ritual of making and drinking chai is younger than the light bulb? India may be the world's largest tea drinking nation today, but widespread tea consumption here is actually a 20th century phenomenon. Yes, for most of history, we did not start our day with a cup of tea. This might sound shocking in a country where chai is not just a beverage, it's an emotion. It's on every street corner. The sound is our morning alarm when waking up in a train. So, how did tea, a Chinese leaf, become India's unofficial national drink? The answer is a story of James Bond level botanical espionage, British colonial greed and brutality, opium addiction, mass migrations of people, some extremely smart marketing, and a cultural makeover that turned British tea into Indian chai. We're going to journey through the fascinating history of tea in India, uncovering stories that most of you might not have heard. Our story begins with two plants that changed the world: the poppy and the camellia. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the British Empire was obsessed with tea, specifically Chinese tea, Camellia sinensis, while China was addicted to British grown opium from Indian poppies, particularly in the region that is today Bihar and Bengal. This led to a very tricky trade triangle. For nearly 200 years, the East India Company sold Indian opium to China and used the money from that to buy Chinese tea. It was a lucrative cycle. Opium sales financed British rule in India, and taxes on tea sales made Britain insanely wealthy. But this dope for tea trade had nasty consequences. As China's Qing emperors realized opium was ruining their people, they tried to ban it, only to provoke the infamous Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842. Britain's warships forced China to keep the tea and opium flowing. In truth, these were as much tea wars as they were opium wars. Britain simply could not live without its daily cup of tea. So Britain was hooked on Chinese tea and were basically drug dealing to afford it. But clearly, this was not sustainable. So the British wanted a plan B: grow tea themselves on Indian soil. So they would not need to buy from China at all. Step one in that plan was James Bond, who liked his martini shaken, not stirred, but very few people know that he also preferred his chai adrak wali and not plain. I'm of course kidding. It was not James Bond, it was someone way more hardcore. In the 1830s, the British hatched a plot to break China's monopoly on tea. Enter a Scottish botanist and adventurer named Robert Fortune, a real-life 19th century plant spy. He even looked a bit like Sean Connery with sideburns. In 1848, Fortune was hired by the East India Company to go on a mission even James Bond would have considered too risky. Sneak into inland China, where foreigners were banned, disguise himself as a Chinese person, and smuggle out tea plants, seeds, and the knowledge of how to cultivate the plant. Yes, this actually happened. Fortune shaved his hairline, donned a fake ponytail down to his back, and dressed in Chinese clothes to look like a Chinese merchant. He later wrote that the barber scraped my poor head till tears came, and as he got into the disguise, sort of like Yul Brynner trying to pass off as Thai in The King and I. Armed with plant samples and a crazy appetite for risk-taking, Fortune ventured into the misty tea mountains of Fujian and beyond. He risked pirates, bandits, disease, and Qing laws that threatened death to spies, all in pursuit of the tea plant. And guess what? He succeeded. Kind of. Fortune smuggled out thousands of tea seeds and even brought skilled Chinese tea workers to teach the British how to process leaves. He even used glass Wardian cases. These are like early terrariums, which is a container to transport live plants to keep the seedlings alive on the long sea voyage to India. It was one of history's greatest acts of industrial espionage, and Britain could finally attempt to grow its own Chinese tea. But there was a twist. Unknown to fortune, tea was already growing wild in India. Around the same time, British officers in northeast India discovered indigenous tea plants in the jungles of Assam. Local tribes like the Singpo were brewing a beverage from these leaves long before the British arrived. In 1823, a trader named Robert Bruce encountered this wild Assam tea and sent samples to experts. Eventually, botanists confirmed this plant was a variation of the tea species later named Camellia sinensis var. Assamica. The British suddenly had two sources of tea: smuggled Chinese seedlings and native Assamese tea. The 1830s and 40s saw a crazy tea rush in Assam. The East India Company set up experimental gardens, planting both Chinese and Assamese tea varieties. They even brought in a few Chinese tea experts to help a Scotsman, Charles Alexander Bruce, Robert's brother, to learn the craft of tea processing. In 1838, the very first harvests of Assamese tea were shipped to London. They caused a sensation when auctioned in January 1839. Buyers paid higher prices than they did for Chinese tea. Within weeks, investors in London rushed to create the Assam Tea Company, a company that still exists today. The British press hyped up tea. Owning a tea garden in Assam became the Victorian equivalent of a Silicon Valley startup. Everyone wanted a share. By the 1850s, tea plantations were all over across Assam. But despite early setbacks like diseases, logistical nightmares, because there weren't any national highways back then, and frankly, not knowing what they were doing exactly, the industry still persisted. Plantations also spread to other areas. The most important one, the hills of Darjeeling, where Chinese, not the native Assamese tea seeds, thrived in the 1850s, producing the famous Darjeeling tea. And down south in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, after 1867, when a fungus wiped out the island's coffee crop and planters desperately turned to tea. By 1888, India overtook China as the world's largest tea exporter, flooding British markets with empire-grown tea. The tables had turned. The once one-sided China trade was now outmatched by giant tea estates in British India and Ceylon. But of course, it was the 1800s. There is no story of large-scale enterprise without human exploitation. And that brings us to a darker side of the history of tea. The British had land and tea plants, but who was going to do the back-breaking work of clearing jungles and picking leaves under the hot sun? Local Assamese villagers were largely unwilling. Why would they sign up for brutal plantation labor? So the planters looked elsewhere across India for a cheap, replaceable workforce. This is a pattern you see all around the world. It began a huge migration of labor, one that still echoes in ethnic issues today. The method was brutal and simple. Find poor people desperate enough to move anywhere and do any job to make a living or pay off a debt. From the 1860s onwards, thousands of poor people from eastern and southern India were recruited, often deceived or forced to work in Assam's tea gardens and Ceylon's highland estates. Agents went around in regions like Bengal, Bihar, Odisha, and the tribal belt of central India, Chota Nagpur, to sign up laborers. Many were Adivasi people, Santals, Mundas, Orans, Gonds, and others, lured by false promises or outright kidnapped into indentured service. The journey to the tea gardens was absolute hell. Packed into train compartments and riverboats, these recruits, men, women, children, traveled thousands of kilometers from their home villages into the unknown. On arrival, reality hit hard. The plantations were deep in the jungle, run by British managers with almost total authority. Conditions for workers were terrible. Many would die in early years due to malaria, cholera, and sheer exhaustion. One report from the 1880s compared the methods of some tea labor recruiters to African slave traders, noting that numbers of coolies have been seen handcuffed, a rope around their wrists, dragged by a couple of supervisors and encouraged to a quick pace by brass-knobbed lathis. On the plantations, laborers, derogatorily called coolies, toiled from dawn to dusk for very little. Plantation managers enforced discipline ruthlessly. Floggings and imprisonment were not uncommon in the early days. Although technically indentured rather than enslaved, these workers really had no freedoms. Desertion was punishable, and debts kept many stuck to the estates. By the turn of the 20th century, humanitarian reformers in India were decrying the tea gardens as a new system of slavery. Yet the tea industry kept expanding, demanding more hands. Entire families and communities ended up settled in Assam and Ceylon. By 1900, the Assam tea districts alone housed hundreds of thousands of these migrant workers. Their descendants eventually formed a distinct community in Assam, today often called the tea tribes or tea garden community. Numbering around 7 million people, they still live mostly in and around the tea estates. Many of them are ethnically different from the native Assamese population, and this has led to modern day tensions. The tea tribe communities, many of whom are Adivasis by origin, have long struggled for recognition and rights. They've campaigned to be listed as scheduled tribes in Assam, which would grant them some benefits, but native tribal groups in Assam have resisted, fearing dilution of their own privileges. The dispute has even sparked clashes and violence in recent decades. This is not the first time British-era transplanting of people for labor has sown the seeds of identity conflicts that persist centuries later. Meanwhile, in Sri Lanka, Ceylon, by 1946, some 780,000 Indian origin Tamils were living on the tea estates, about 11% of Ceylon's population. After independence, the Sinhalese majority government passed a controversial law denying these Tamils citizenship, rendering over 700,000 people stateless overnight. This contributed to ethnic problems in Sri Lanka for decades. So every time you enjoy a cup of tea to relax, think about the dark history behind it. So the British started growing tea at a massive scale. But there is another twist. Even as late as 1900, the average Indian just did not drink tea. Tea was an export crop, a fancy drink for British officers and wealthy Indian elites who sipped it British style with milk and sugar in cups and saucers. The vast majority of Indians were either unaware of tea or outright suspicious of it. In the early 20th century, many Indians saw tea as a strange, bitter drink, perhaps even a vice. One pamphlet from 1916 by an Indian writer warned that drinking tea would make men impotent and induce a lazy, indolent habit. The British plantation companies realized they had a huge untapped market right under their noses, hundreds of millions of Indians. With tea consumption flatlining in Britain and America by the 1920s, the colonial powers turned their attention to India's domestic market. It was time for a full-on propaganda blitz to turn Indians into tea lovers, to transform tea into chai. Thus began one of history's most successful advertising campaigns. In 1903, the colonial government set up the Tea Cess Committee, later renamed the Indian Tea Market Expansion Board in 1937, specifically to promote tea drinking in India. It was a massive state-funded marketing push, arguably one of the largest in Indian history. Here are some of the creative tactics they used. 1. Early advertisements treated tea as totally new. They even printed instructions on how to brew tea properly, since many people simply did not know. For example, boil water, add a pinch of tea, a bit of milk, and sugar. Pretty basic, but necessary in 1910. Enamel signboards from the 1940s still survive, showing step-by-step tea recipes for beginners. 2. Free samples. The tea board distributed cheap trial packets, pice packets of tea for 1 paisa. In villages and towns, special tea vans roamed the country handing out free cups of tea at fairs, railway stations, and marketplaces. These demonstration teams would just set up shop at a local festival and start brewing tea on the spot, enticing crowds to taste this strange new drink. One report says millions of sample cups were given away, It was the original try before you buy strategy. 3. To hook people, the tea board convinced factories, mills, and mines to introduce official tea breaks for workers. The idea was that tired laborers, once offered a hot, sweet cup of tea, would acquire the habit and productivity would improve. This is how the tea break became a standard in Indian work culture, a colonial invention that stuck. Even the expanding railways were enlisted. Chai vendors were set up on station platforms so that train travelers could grab a quick cup during stops. 4. The campaign also cleverly targeted Indian women, especially in conservative households where an outside man selling tea might not be welcome. They deployed all female tea squads to go door to door to conservative homes, demonstrating tea preparation to housewives. The pitch was serving tea was modern and respectable, something that would make you a better hostess. Advertisements in the 1930s and 40s often showed elegant Indian women in saris gracefully pouring tea to associate the drink with a cultured yet modern lifestyle. 5. The British marketed tea as a healthy, energizing beverage, a far cry from how Indians viewed it initially. They claimed it would banish fatigue and even implied it could inculcate British style qualities like punctuality and alertness in Indians. They also touted tea as the national drink that could unite Indians of all communities. Yes, ironically, the colonizers tried to wrap tea in the flag of Indian nationalism. Basically, anything to sell a product and make money. They even got Mahatma Gandhi's attention, albeit not how they hoped. Gandhi himself scathingly wrote in 1942 that tea was completely unnecessary, noting that one could just drink hot water with milk and sugar for the same effect. He was not impressed with chai, calling it an addictive habit being forced on Indians. And oh, fun fact, between black coffee and green tea, it's coffee that has better evidence for being good for your health, not tea. But let's get back to our story. In fact, in the early days of this massive marketing push for tea, many Indians resisted. In the 1920s, over 90% of India's tea crop was still being exported. But slowly, these efforts paid off. By the 1930s and 40s, a tea drinking culture was taking root in Indian cities and railway towns. The chaiwala became a common sight, making strong sweet chai with lots of milk and sugar to suit local tastes. In fact, Indians put their own spin on tea. Vendors began adding spices like ginger, cardamom, cinnamon, creating masala chai. This was again classic jugaad. Tea was expensive. Ginger was not. So masala chai needed less tea leaves. The British Tea Association initially hated that spices and extra milk were used since it meant using fewer tea leaves per cup, but it did not matter. The milky, spicy, extra sweet chai was here to stay. And the British eventually had to accept that some tea sold was better than none. By independence in 1947, India still was not the tea-obsessed nation it is now. One estimate says over 70% of the tea grown was still exported at that time. But the groundwork was laid. In the following decades, Indian-owned brands took over and ran with the idea of chai for everyone. They even transformed the colonial messaging on its head, declaring tea as 100% Swadeshi in ads. Well, today, India is one of the world's largest producers and consumers of tea. The chai culture is so deeply ingrained that it's hard to imagine that it had to be taught through marketing propaganda. From the Himalayan foothills to Kanyakumari, from urban tech offices to rural dhabas, chai is the great social leveler. Offered to guests, sipped in business meetings, debated over in college canteens, shared in a cutting glass, and enjoyed simply as a moment of calm in an otherwise chaotic day. It is fascinating that this culture is barely 100 to 150 years old. And let's not forget, India gave the world the word chai, which simply comes from the Chinese cha. So it's always interesting when Indians laugh at Starbucks calling it chai tea. But if you remember what I told you a while ago, India adapted tea to its own tastes. More spices, more sugar, more milk. So when Starbucks says chai tea, all they're saying is that this is the Indian way of making tea and not the British way. But because chai means tea here, it sounds funny. It's a bit like matcha tea. Matcha means powdered tea because cha is tea. But back to our story, there's a certain poetic justice in how a foreign leaf, originally procured as part of the opium drug trade, promoted aggressively by colonizers, is now an emblem of Indian hospitality and resilience. Post independence, the Indian Tea Board and local entrepreneurs took over the enterprise and reframed tea as a patriotic beverage. Advertisements that once showed English ladies at tea time were replaced by images of Indians of every region and religion sipping tea together. There were a series of innovations and campaigns that cemented chai as the subcontinent's favorite drink. In the 1950s, Indian tea experts perfected the crush, tear, curl (CTC) processing method, which produced cheaper, quick brewing granulated tea. CTC technology meant a little tea lasted for a longer time, making a stronger brew with less leaf. Suddenly, even a laborer could afford a daily cup. In one particularly poetic twist, a Gujarati tea company, Wagh Bakri, built its entire brand around tea's power to bridge social divides. Its logo shows a tiger, Wagh, representing people with money and power, and a goat, Bakri, representing those that are exploited, enjoying a cup of tea together. By the 1980s, Doordarshan aired the iconic Taj Mahal tea ad featuring Ustad Zakir Hussain. By the 1990s, tea ads became even more playful, like this one featuring Javed Jafri parodying the hit song Jumma Chumma De De. And in the 2000s, tea became the marketing vessel for social consciousness. And in the 2010s, Chai Pe Charcha is how prime ministers communicated with the masses. The story of tea is nothing short of remarkable. From a foreign leaf to opium trade to James Bond style espionage to human exploitation to rich Indians trying to emulate their British masters to a complete U-turn to a Swadeshi drink that brought people together to finally become the deeply Indian emotion we associate the drink with today. I still prefer coffee though.
Explaining the science of food and debunking pseudoscience is hard work. So I request you to consider becoming a member of this channel. Members get to be part of a private group that will work together to dig into the science of food in far more detail and also discover the true joy of food.